This is a Bay Original podcast.
Hello everyone, my name is Clayton and I'm your host for today's podcast, Voices of Pride. This is an initiative by 897 Bay in collaboration with Ilgas Rainbow Communities, where we bring you the Malta Pride and GayMalta.com. In this podcast, we want to bring different voices from the LGBTIQ community to talk about anything and everything that reflects us as individuals, members of society, and as a global community. Today, here with me, I have Mina Jack Tolu, and in today's episode, we're going to talk about trans identities. So, hello Mina, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thanks for the invitation, it's great to be here.
So, for those who maybe don't know you or follow you, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself?
Of course. At the moment, my name is Mina Jack Tolu. Jack is a recent addition to my name. I'm a trans and non-binary person and activist, and Mina Jack as a name together reflects that to me, that I am neither male nor female, and to me there is a mix of both, but not every non-binary person has the same experience or journey. I work as a strategic communications consultant, specifically on LGBTQI issues. I've done a lot of work supporting international LGBTIQ NGOs in campaign work and their communications, like Transgender Europe, where I worked for 3 years, and IGLIO, the International LGBTQ Youth and Student Organization. But more recently, I've taken that experience of, say, broadly, like LGBTQI communications, and started working as a trans consultant on sets in Italy, where I would help them work on trans characters that are more authentic and more representative, and let's say less stereotyped than we often are actually shown on the media. So that's broadly who I am. I love sports. I cycle a lot, and I'm part of Honey Island Rollers, a roller derby team that we just started here.
So if I may, actually Italy, although on Ilgas Rainbow Map and maybe in general there is a homophobic or transphobic attitude, the fact that there is a need for consultancy is a positive sign, no?
It's a positive sign, yes, but it kind of reflects where the world of streaming is also taking Europe and pushing Europe to be. And so when you've got the big streaming giants like Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and HBO also starting to produce content in Europe that is very localized and written by us, so to say, then there are certain standards that have to be met. And so whereas in the US, the international studios have been working very much with GLAAD, it's an organization that works on LGBTQI representation in the media, and have set up standards over the past decade or two, suddenly we're seeing the kind of they're importing those standards also into the European productions that they're co-producing here with. So in Italy, although on the Ilga Europe map, indeed, there's a long way to go in terms of legislation, but also social attitude and social change. There have been local production, national production companies that were willing to take this step and have more representative trans characters on their shows.
Wow. And since you mentioned that you are a trans non-binary individual, how would you prefer people to refer you as?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, my pronouns are they and he. He is a recent addition, and it's a recent addition because I was living and working in Italy for 8 months, where the language is very binary, similar to Maltese in some ways, but also slightly different in that the gender is everywhere, also when you're referring to yourself. And I realized how challenging it was and how actually very difficult it was for me to be referring to myself as feminine all the time in Italian. And so actually being in a space where I was working in Italian and living in Italian for some months made me realize the necessity to actually I felt the need to have also masculine pronouns to refer to myself. And having said that, when it comes to pronouns, of course, they, them in English, it's super comfortable and allows many non-binary or gender non-conforming people to feel very also included within a language, but it is not just non-binary and gender non-conforming people who are going to use they, them pronouns, or those of us who are bilingual or have more than one mother tongue might be using different solutions in different languages. And then so the best thing to do is always to ask, as you have just done, to just make sure that we're on the same page. But yeah, they in English, but masculine pronouns in Maltese, and Italian is kind of where I'm at the moment.
Okay, so I feel like we've ran towards the conversation where we're already at an advanced stage of understanding trans issues. But perhaps for those who are listening or viewing us, could you please go back to basics about trans identities, gender expression, sexual orientation? What's the difference?
Yes. Okay. So when we talk about trans people, we talk about people who were assigned, who do not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. I was, for instance, assigned female at birth, and I no longer identify that way, and this is why I also use the trans, let's say, umbrella identity to be part of. There's being trans is a unique experience to each of us. There are many trans people who will not only socially transition. By social transition, I mean changing a name, changing pronouns, starting to live within their family or amongst friends and starting to express themselves as who they are. But there are those of us who also medically transition, which might mean a number of different procedures depending on the person. Again, it's very individual experience and choice that needs to be respected. And so obviously there's going to be a wide variety of diversity also within the trans community, of people who, like me, haven't medically transitioned yet or might not intend to medically transition, and those who choose to medically transition before coming out as trans. And again, that's every individual has their way to approach this. But often there are outdated terms now, but things like female to male or male to female, transgender or transsexual, they're outdated terms to use in terms of say to be heard in the media or to be overarching terms that people talk about. But if an individual identifies as a transsexual or as an F2M or as an M2F, that is obviously their choice, and they have the agency to do that. But in general, some people might have heard of trans and immediately in their mind they're talking about transsexual or F2M, M2F, and as a community, in terms of our activism and on our advocacy, we've gone beyond that, and we talk about transgender rights or trans rights. And we also talk about gender identity and gender expression. And this is because everyone has a gender identity and everyone has a gender expression. And the recognition of those, however, is not granted to everyone. So the recognition of one's gender identity is not granted to trans people in most countries in the world. And the liberty to freely express your gender as you wish is also something that tends to be questioned if the way you express your gender goes against the norms of society of what it means to be a man or a woman, and goes against the norms of society that believes there are only men and women, and that kind of binary notion of very rigid gender norms. And so when we talk about gender identity and gender expression, identity is really like what you feel, who you feel you are, and it might not always align with someone's gender expression in kind of normative sense. I have a very masculine presenting gender expression. That's how I perceive it, but I know that there are some people out there who might not perceive it that way because they might hear my voice or see me and fit me into a female category, and that's just the way it is. And
I believe there is no one age when one comes out as trans, right? It can go through the whole spectrum of one's life cycle.
Yeah, I think we hear a lot of stories of young kids who know already who they are at such a young age and have that amazing clarity and awareness to know, like, oh, I'm a boy or I'm a girl, and have parents to support them and who accompany them along that journey and understanding what that's like. In my experience, for example, I only came out 6 years ago. I think it's very much due to the fact that there was no representation of non-binary people out there, and there is hardly any representation of trans people in Malta and in Europe, or even beyond that when I was younger. So it was very challenging for me to see myself. And if you can't see yourself, then you kind of think, well, no one else feels like this, so maybe I should hide this. But then it also depends on, the negative stereotypes that we're seeing. So for a long time, and in fact, even to this day, the majority of trans people that are represented, that are hyper visible, are trans women. Whereas trans masculine or trans men are more invisibilized. That this isn't, I'm very neutral in this regard. The hypervisibility of trans women leads to a lot of violence against trans women. The hypervisibility that is very stereotyped leads to a lot of violence towards trans women. However, the complete invisibility of non-binary identities and trans masculine folk leads to a certain level of safety in our regard, but also confusion for younger folks who might not be seeing themselves anywhere. And so it's actually, I'd say, like, not the ideal situation in either sense. Kind of just representation where we are authentically shown as ourselves, where we understand that there's a diversity of identities also within the trans community, would be so much more meaningful. And it's what I'm trying to do with my work. It's what I was trying to do in my work in Italy in the past year, and it's what many activists start to also work on, a more just narrative and diverse narrative, more voices out there.
And do you feel that, for example, when it comes to streaming giants like Netflix, are doing the right thing with the shows that they're producing and all the TV shows we're seeing?
I think there's this first of all, we need to dissect a bit when we talk about Netflix. There are shows that they produce and develop and put out there from start to finish. And there are shows that they might bring on from outside of their production, but that they want to host on their streaming platform. And so, for instance, on Netflix, there's the documentary Disclosure, which I recommend to anyone to watch, which talks about trans representation in U.S. media over the years, and really shows that clear link between that hypervisibility of trans women as being shown as dangerous as a number of in a number of very negative ways, and how that leads to more violence towards the trans community. They also comment about the fact that when you have a cis person, side note, cis or cisgender literally means just the same gender you are assigned at birth. And so it's often we say, well, if there are transgender people, then there are cisgender people. Similarly as saying when people finally started using the word gay, or well before that homosexuality, there's like, okay, well, if there's homosexuality, there's heterosexuality as well. And so when cis men act as trans women, for instance, it perpetuates the wrong message that it perpetuates that trans women are just men dressed as women, which is not the case. Trans women are women and express their womanhood in a variety of ways. But when you have cis men play them in television or in cinema, it's going to lead to a lot of violence. Now, when it comes to Netflix and other streaming giants, so to say, I think we start to see more LGBT characters we start to see more trans women that are representative in more authentic ways, like with Pose, for instance. And slowly we start to see some non-binary characters and some trans men as well, and also children. But that's complicated when it comes to casting and like the ethics of media representation. But I think that if some people say we're 10% of the population, then that should kind of be reflected in our characters. We can't always be seeing the same kind of families, the same kind of stories out there. And I think we start to see that across, let's say, marginalized communities, that more of our stories are being told. And that's extremely positive. Now, whether these companies do it because they truly believe that they need to represent the diverse communities that they're showing to, or because they know it's a good marketing model, is obviously another question. And Yeah.
So keeping on the same subject, recently there's a whole controversy about Dave Chappelle's stand-up special called Closer, where at some point he makes reference to J.K. Rowling's and completely siding, saying Team TERF. And now there's a whole walkout being planned from trans and allies staff of Netflix, walking out from Netflix. Netflix actually fired someone who's trans for disclosing information which is considered confidential. So what do you make of this? Should someone like Dave Chappelle be allowed to have his own show, say his own jokes, or is there a fine line in this?
Well, I think the question should be, should Netflix, who have committed to diversity, who have actually hosted Disclosure, who have also shows by LGBTQI people on their platform, and who have said that they are championing our rights and our stories and want to show the diversity. I think the question should be not whether an artist can say these things, but whether Netflix as a platform should be platforming those views and showing them, and whether their reaction was just or not. I think that firing members of staff who speak up about perhaps the kind of hypocrisies of working in a company that is on the surface, going out there as an LGBTI-friendly employer, and then perhaps what's happening behind the scenes is a bit different, is absolutely unacceptable. And I think the planned walkout by trans and non-binary and staff and allies to the trans community is really important. But when it comes to Chappelle's standout, which I haven't watched and I will not watch, unfortunately, trans people have been the butt of many jokes for decades, and it's really challenging to fight against that. And what's happening in the UK, for instance, there's a huge media backlash against trans people, where even though we're a small community, almost every week, every couple of days, there's something new against trans people, as if we're this big threat to, society. And it's trans people now, but it was gay men 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they're using the same rhetoric of danger to children, of harm to society, society's very moral fabric, and then it really hurts when there's no support, or there's no kind of left alone to deal with this. And thankfully, this backlash is not happening everywhere, but because it is happening in English language press in the UK, in the US, then it has its reach is much more international, and we start to see those implications of that backlash elsewhere. But it was always there. There will always be people who do not believe that trans people exist, that do not believe that we as trans people can truly know who we are, that will want to frame us as a disorder. And again, this is happening to trans community now, but it was happening to gay men until the 1990s when homosexuality was still listed as a mental disorder, right? So we're just kind of seeing a repetition of that cycle, and so taking the opportunity on this podcast to ask, the cisgender people within our LGBTQI community to support us and to learn from us and to magnify our voices and to amplify our voices and our stories as trans people, rather than the very loud hatred that, however, is just coming from very few people.
That's right. Yeah. And also tied with this, with media representation, recently as well, there was this comic about Batman's son coming out as bisexual, and there was this whole furore of people commenting, saying, "Oh, this is now the end of the world. This is too much. Why are you doing this?" So, what is your reply to this? Why is it necessary? Or
I think when it comes to characters like Superman, that so many people might have in their imagination as this
alpha male,
this, like
the pinnacle of strength, and
and all of that, then any aspect of queerness that might stem from that is actually having people challenge their own masculinities, perhaps. And I'm saying their own masculinities because I feel like it's a lot of men that I've seen commenting about this. And for many people who even would have bought a Superman shirt and would have it under their shirt, or who have maybe dressed up as Superman in Carnival, or have a poster or have read those comics, they might have this very deep-rooted kind of identification with that character, and to have suddenly this character have a bisexual son, it means they start to challenge and question their own strength. So I wonder if you're championing a character just because it seems like he is this pinnacle of masculinity and all that, then I'm glad that just this slight, this very small piece of news is going to make people challenge and question themselves. I hope they're challenging and questioning themselves about why that made them uncomfortable. And if they have kids, I hope that they would be more open to their kids coming out as LGBT if that were the case. Because, it just says a lot about, to me, it says a lot about masculinity and the masculine role models we have in the world, and how those masculine role models are not allowed to be gay.
That's right. And when it comes to trans rights, how do you feel they differ from sexual orientation, diverse rights? So usually we put them all under one hat, one cap, saying LGBTIQ rights. But actually there are specific needs, specific, I
think it's super... there's a lot of strength gained by the trans community in fighting alongside the LGBT community for rights. However, often what I'm seeing, what we observe and see in Europe is trans rights are very related to bodily autonomy, and I would almost say there is as much overlap between the rights for rights based on gender identity and gender expression with sexual orientation and sexual characteristics as there are for with sexual and reproductive health and rights as well. And so I think that actually the LGBT rights movement has to work more closely with feminist movements. We're talking a lot about, when it comes to trans rights, we're talking about body politics, really. It's about the autonomy to be recognized as who you are without unnecessary medical procedures. So I'll be a bit more clear about that. In in Malta until 2015, when the law changed, in order to have your document reflect who you really are, that's your ID card or your passport, your birth certificate, in order to change your name and your gender marker from an M to an F or an F to an M, you had to undergo medical procedures. So you had to medically transition in order to be recognized as who you are. Not all trans people want to medically transition. Many laws in the world on legal gender recognition, so actually changing our documents to reflect who we really are tied to a medical model. And so unless a trans person has done hormone therapy, unless they have had some pretty intense interventions on their body and been sterilized, and they are not allowed to change their documents, which is extremely discriminatory. And in Europe, Finland, the Czech Republic, these are EU countries, still have a sterilization requirement for trans people to change their documents. So when I say that trans rights are as connected to the fights by feminists as they are connected to LGBT rights, this is what I mean. When it comes to sterilization, forced sterilization of trans people, trans people are fighting in those countries for the right to have children if they want to, and then we've got many feminists fighting for the right not to have children, and it's all about reproductive rights and that choice, that final choice on our bodies being, I decide, and that's autonomy and bodily integrity and all of that. So things are changing, but we, as a trans community, need to fight alongside the LGBT community and cis women for our rights. And hopefully both these movements are also fighting together with us and not using us as scapegoats, because there's always going to be a scapegoat.
So when it comes to trans rights globally, let's maybe focus around Europe. Where do you see the fight going on?
I think we've got different levels of fights in Europe. So on the one hand, there's the fight for depathologization, and to not have legal gender recognition tied to a medical diagnosis and medical procedures, which is something that is almost a constant in many countries. The fight against forced sterilization is one that has been rather successful, but there are still too many countries that require trans people to be forcefully sterilized, and within the EU as well. And that is something that, let's say, on a European policy front, that is being worked on. Then I think that what we're seeing and what we're looking at is the kind of backlash in general towards LGBTI rights in Poland, in Hungary, that also obviously impacts trans people. And it impacts trans people, or it impacts anyone who's gender non-conforming the most on a day-to-day level, because we stand out. We're kind of identifiable as someone who's going against the norms of society, going against the idea of what it means to be a man or a woman. And as soon as we start to push against those ideas, it is more likely that we will experience threats of violence or just hate speech. And I think that in this sense, visible trans people, but also gay men, lesbian women who do not fit a very normative understanding of men or women are all kind of under attack, and this is why we really need to stick together and work together against this. I think some fights for trans people in Europe relate to access to health, to trans-specific healthcare. The waiting lists are incredibly long in many countries to access hormones and other procedures. And this is actually quite harmful. It might mean trans people deciding to do it themselves without any medical professional following them. And so this kind of, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously a slowing down of many things. However, in some spaces, trans healthcare did not seem to fit into the priorities when it is a priority for some people who need ongoing access, and for some people who are waiting because there's a delayed access. It's actually quite harmful. So trans-specific healthcare that is based on informed consent, that is based on human rights, is something that almost doesn't exist anywhere in Europe, and this will continue to be a fight for trans people. But again, separating our right to access trans-specific healthcare from our right to change our documents is
crucial.
Yes.
So my last question to you: what words of wisdom you wish to impart?
That's a good one. I mean, it's cliche to say, like, tell people to be themselves, but when I came out the first time, and you never finish coming out, but as you know, probably, right. when I came out the first time to my family and my parents, it gave me a lot of strength to recognize what other areas in life I might have been just following along the flow of what I thought I was meant to be doing, and it allowed me to challenge myself, and I actually quit the university course I was doing and started another one that was more interesting to me, and I continue to challenge myself in those ways. So being yourself is not just about finding that comfort to come out and to share with the world, but it's also about the impact it has on your life is amazing, and to me that is about honesty, like having that, finally being, even just coming out to yourself and finally being honest with yourself about who you are and not hiding from it, is going to help you be honest to yourself about other areas in your life that maybe you've been resisting to change but need it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mina Jack. It's been a pleasure having you, and I hope to see more of your activism.
Thank you so much, Clay.
So thank you for tuning in and listening. This podcast has been brought to you by Ilgas Rainbow Communities in collaboration with 897 Bay. If you would like to know more about us, visit gaymalta.com or follow us on Facebook or Instagram, ArcMalta. Thank you very much.
This is a Bay Original Podcast.